A homeless man at a Miami bus stop clutches his worn resumes after another day of rejection when he notices a shivering woman beside him. And without hesitation, he removes his only jacket and offers it to her with a gentle smile that hides years of pain and struggle. But what this man Adam doesn't know is that this simple act of kindness is about to change everything. Because the woman Clare Langston is not just anyone, she is a CEO who will soon discover his identity, and the discovery will lead to a moment that will transform both their lives forever as she learns about his engineering background, his devastating fall from grace, and the unshakable dignity he maintained through it all. And when morning comes, Claire cannot stop thinking about the man who had nothing yet gave everything. And she makes a decision that will prove how one moment of genuine human connection can ripple out in ways neither of them could have imagined, creating an opportunity that will challenge everything they thought they knew about success, failure, redemption, and the true meaning of wealth. The Miami evening air carried that peculiar heaviness that comes just before the ocean breeze shifts and brings relief from the day's humidity. But for Adam Thompson, sitting on the weathered bench at the Biscayville bus stop, there was no relief. To be found only the weight of another failed day pressing down on his 44-year-old shoulders, like a physical burden he could almost feel in his bones and muscles. Adam sat with his back straight despite everything, maintaining that posture. He had learned during his years as a construction engineer when presentation mattered, and confidence was currency in the boardrooms where he once presented structural designs for buildings that now dotted Miami's skyline like monuments to a life. He used to live, and his hands still bore the calluses from his early days working job sites before he climbed the corporate ladder. And those same hands now clutched a manila folder containing 23 resumes that had been printed at the public library, where the librarian, Mrs. Chen, knew him by name, and always let him print a few extra pages without charging him because she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her own brother, who had fallen on hard times years ago. Resumes were getting worn now from being carried around in his backpack, which also contained everything else he owned in this world, including a change of clothes that he washed in public restroom sinks, a toothbrush and toothpaste, a small notebook where he kept track of job applications and their responses, or lack thereof, a water bottle he refilled at drinking fountains throughout the city, and a photograph of his daughter Emma, who was now 19 and living with her mother in Oregon, completely unaware that her father was homeless because Adam had been too proud to tell her when things first started going wrong, and now too much time had passed, and the shame had grown too large to overcome. Today had been particularly brutal, with 5 interviews scheduled, and all 5 ending in polite rejections that felt like small deaths each time, because Adam could see it in their eyes the moment they looked at his application gap, the 3 years missing from his employment history that he couldn't adequately explain without revealing everything about the accident that wasn't his fault, but somehow became his responsibility anyway, when the company needed a scapegoat, and the lawsuit that followed draining his savings for legal fees that ultimately didn't matter because his reputation in the industry was destroyed regardless of the verdict. The first interview had been at a small engineering firm in Coral Gables, where the owner, a man named Martinez, had seemed genuinely interested until he asked about the gap, and Adam had tried to explain about the building collapse that happened on a project he supervised, even though the structural failure was due to materials that didn't meet specifications provided by a supplier, who cut corners to save money. But somehow Adam, as the supervising engineer, became the face of the disaster in the media, and the company threw him under the bus to protect their brand. And Martinez had nodded sympathetically, but Adam saw his eyes glaze over with that look that said, "This is too complicated and too risky, and we can't take a chance on someone with this kind of baggage, no matter how qualified they might be." The second interview was at a construction company in Hialeah, where the HR manager, a young woman probably half Adam's age, had barely looked up from her phone as she asked him routine questions, and when he mentioned his previous position as senior engineer at Castellan Development, she had actually Googled the company right there in front of him. And the first result was an article about the collapse with Adam's name prominently featured in the second paragraph, and her demeanor changed instantly from bored professionalism to barely concealed suspicion, as if he might somehow cause her office building to collapse just by sitting in it. The third, fourth, and fifth interviews blurred together into a series of uncomfortable silences, raised eyebrows, and variations of "we'll be in touch" that Adam had learned to recognize as permanent rejection. And now, as the sun set over Miami, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful. If Adam had any capacity left to appreciate beauty, he sat at this bus stop with no particular bus to catch because he wasn't going anywhere specific, just killing time, until he could make his way to the shelter where, if he arrived before 8 p.m., he might get a bed for the night, instead of sleeping in the park where he had spent the last 4 nights after the shelter reached capacity. The bench where Adam sat was one of those modern designs that looked sleek, but was actually engineered to prevent homeless people from lying down on it. A irony not lost on Adam given his background in design. And he wondered if whoever designed this bench had ever considered that they might one day be the person who needed to lie down on it, or if they had simply collected their paycheck and moved on to the next project without thinking about the human consequences of their choices. Adam was contemplating this and staring at nothing in particular when he noticed the woman sitting at the other end of the bench, and he wondered how long she had been there because he had been so lost in his own thoughts that he hadn't registered her arrival, and she was dressed in what Adam's trained eye recognized as expensive professional attire, a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than he used to spend on clothes in a month back when he had months where he spent money on clothes, and her shoes were designer heels that looked painful but fashionable, and her hair was pulled back in a style that said executive or lawyer or someone who made decisions that affected other people's lives. But what caught Adam's attention now was that she was shivering, and it wasn't particularly cold by most standards, maybe 70 degrees, but Miami natives knew that temperature was relative. And when you spent all day in air-conditioned offices, 70 degrees in the evening could feel chilly, especially if you were wearing a suit designed more for appearance than warmth, and she had her arms wrapped around herself in that universal gesture of trying to conserve body heat, and Adam could see goosebumps on her forearms. Adam looked down at himself at the jacket he was wearing, which was actually a pretty decent jacket, a Columbia windbreaker that he had owned since before everything fell apart, and it was one of the few items he had managed to hold on to through everything, and it was probably the nicest thing he still owned besides his watch, which he kept, because it had been a gift from Emma on his 40th birthday, and he couldn't bring himself to sell it, even when he desperately needed money. The jacket kept him warm on cool evenings and provided a thin barrier against rain, and it also served another crucial purpose, which was making him look slightly more presentable than he would otherwise, like having this one decent piece of clothing somehow made him feel less invisible, more like a person who just happened to be down on his luck, rather than someone who had completely fallen out of society. But even as he thought about all the practical reasons to keep the jacket, Adam found himself standing up and walking the few feet to where the woman sat. "Excuse me?" Adam said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended because he hadn't spoken to anyone since his last interview 3 hours ago. And the woman looked up, startled, and Adam saw her eyes do that quick assessment that people do when a stranger approaches them in public, especially a stranger who looked like he might be homeless even with the decent jacket. And Adam saw her hand move slightly toward her purse in an instinctive protective gesture. "I noticed you're cold," Adam continued quickly before she could dismiss him or move away. "You can have my jacket if you want," and he was already shrugging out of it as he spoke, not giving her time to refuse or giving himself time to reconsider this impulse that made no logical sense, because he needed this jacket, probably more than she did, since she was clearly someone with resources who could just call an Uber and be home in her warm house within 20 minutes, while he would be standing at bus stops and walking streets for hours yet. The woman stared at him with an expression Adam couldn't quite read: surprise, definitely, but also something else, maybe confusion or suspicion, and she opened her mouth as if to refuse, but then she seemed to really see him for the first time, not just glancing at him, the way people look at homeless individuals with that deliberate not seeing that allowed them to maintain their bubble of comfortable ignorance, but actually looking at his face, seeing the exhaustion there and the worn dignity, and something in his eyes that suggested he hadn't always been this person, sitting at bus stops with nowhere to go. "I couldn't take your jacket," she said finally. But her protest sounded weak, like she didn't really believe her own words, and Adam could see her shivering increase as if her body was betraying her polite reluctance. "Please," Adam said, holding the jacket out to her. "I insist. Really, I'm fine. And I have another layer." And this was a lie, because the t-shirt he wore under the jacket was thin and had holes in it that he had carefully positioned under the jacket to hide them. But he said it with such conviction that maybe she believed him, or maybe she was just cold enough to accept the kindness of a stranger without questioning it too deeply. She took the jacket with hands that trembled slightly, either from cold or emotion, Adam wasn't sure, and she wrapped it around her shoulders, and Adam saw relief wash over her face immediately, and she looked up at him again. And this time her eyes were different, softer somehow, and filled with something that might have been gratitude but seemed deeper than that. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You have no idea how much I needed this." And there was weight to those words that suggested she wasn't just talking about the jacket, but Adam didn't press because he understood that everyone carried their own burdens. And sometimes those burdens were invisible to observers who only saw the expensive suit and designer shoes and assumed everything was fine. Adam nodded and returned to his end of the bench, and he sat down and tried not to think about how the evening air now felt noticeably cooler against his thin t-shirt, and he picked up his manila folder and pretended to review his resumes, even though he had them memorized by now, every word, every carefully crafted description of his skills and experience that somehow never seemed to be enough to overcome the 3-year gap that loomed like a black hole in his professional timeline. They sat in silence for several minutes, and Adam was acutely aware of her presence even though he kept his eyes on his papers, and he wondered what she was thinking, whether she had already dismissed him as just another homeless person who would be forgotten as soon as she got home, or whether she sensed something about him that didn't quite fit the stereotype. And he wanted to explain to her that he wasn't always like this, that he used to be someone who designed buildings and wore expensive suits and drove a nice car and had a home with furniture. He had carefully selected and a life that made sense. But he also knew that these explanations would sound like the desperate justifications of someone trying to prove their worth to a stranger who had no obligation to care. The bus that the woman was presumably waiting for arrived with a hydraulic hiss and a cloud of exhaust, and she stood up, and Adam expected her to simply leave, to disappear into her world of warmth and security and forget this encounter by tomorrow. But instead she paused and turned back to him, and she started to remove the jacket to return it, but Adam held up his hand. "Keep it," he said. "Please, really. I want you to have it." And he smiled at her, and it was a real smile. Not the fake professional smile he had worn to his 5 interviews today, but a genuine expression that came from some part of himself that still believed in small acts of kindness, even when life had given him every reason to be bitter and cynical. She looked at him for a long moment, and Adam saw her eyes scan his face again, and then dropped to the manila folder in his lap and the worn backpack beside him. And he watched as understanding dawned in her expression, as she put together the pieces of his situation and realized that he wasn't just some good Samaritan who happened to have an extra jacket, but someone who had very little and was giving away something precious. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly, and her voice had changed again, becoming more intense, more present, as if she had decided something in that moment. "Adam," he replied, "Adam Thompson," and he almost extended his hand for a handshake out of old habit from his business days, but stopped himself, because his hands were dirty and he was self-conscious about it. "I'm Clare," she said. "Clare Langston," and now she did extend her hand, and Adam shook it briefly, and her hand was warm and soft compared to his calloused palm. "Thank you, Adam, for your kindness. I won't forget this," and the way she said it made Adam believe her, though he had no idea how literally she meant those words. Then she was gone, stepping onto the bus and finding a seat by the window. And as the bus pulled away, Adam saw her looking back at him through the glass, still wearing his jacket and holding it close around her shoulders. And something about her expression stayed with Adam as he sat back down on the bench and felt the full impact of the cool evening air against his skin. Stayed at the bus stop for another hour, watching the sky darken and the streetlights flicker on, and people came and went, catching buses to destinations where they belonged, while Adam belonged nowhere. And eventually, he picked up his backpack and his folder and began the long walk toward the shelter, hoping the beds weren't already full, knowing that even if they were, he would survive, because he always did, somehow finding a way to make it through another night and another day. Meanwhile, across the city, Clare Langston sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay, still wearing Adam Thompson's jacket, even though her home was kept at a comfortable 72 degrees. And she couldn't stop thinking about the man at the bus stop, about the way he had smiled at her with such genuine warmth, despite the exhaustion in his eyes and the worn condition of his clothes, and she kept running her hands over the jacket, feeling the fabric that was soft from wear and washing. And when she checked the pockets hoping to find some identification or way to contact him, she found instead a business card. So old and faded she could barely read it, but she could make out the name Adam Thompson, Senior Construction Engineer, Castellon Development, and a phone number that was probably disconnected years ago. Claire sat on her modern white sofa in her minimalist living room, surrounded by expensive art and furniture that interior designers had chosen to reflect success and good taste. And she felt more alone than she had in months because, despite all her professional achievements, despite running a tech startup that was valued at over $50 million, despite being featured in Forbes and Business Insider as one of Miami's rising business stars, she was profoundly lonely in ways she rarely admitted to herself. And seeing Adam's simple act of kindness had cracked something open inside her, something she usually kept carefully locked away. She thought about her own struggles, about the panic attacks she hid from her employees, about the sleeping pills she took every night, about the therapist she saw twice a week, who kept suggesting she was working too hard and needed to find balance and meaning beyond her career, about her ex-husband who had left her 2 years ago saying she cared more about her company than their marriage, which had been true but still hurt to hear, and about her parents, who called once a month from their retirement community in Arizona and asked when she was going to settle down and give them grandchildren, as if her entire life's accomplishments meant nothing compared to that biological expectation. And here was this man, Adam, who had nothing, at least in terms of material possessions, but who had given her his jacket without hesitation, who had smiled at her with such warmth and dignity, who had in that brief interaction shown her more genuine human kindness than she had experienced in months of business meetings and networking, events and dinner parties where everyone wanted something from her and saw her only as Clare Langston, the CEO, the success story, the woman who had everything figured out. Claire stood up and walked to her floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the glittering Miami skyline, and she wondered which of those buildings Adam Thompson had helped design, back when he was a senior construction engineer at Castellon Development. And she wondered what had happened to him, how someone with that title, and presumably that salary, had ended up homeless waiting at bus stops with worn resumes. And she felt a strong urge to find out, to understand his story, to somehow help him if she could. She pulled out her phone and did what she always did when she needed information. She started researching, and she typed Adam Thompson Castellon Development into Google, and she found the articles immediately, dozens of them, all dated 3 years ago, all covering the same story about a partial building collapse at a luxury residential development in Fort Lauderdale, about structural failures and investigations about lawsuits and settlements. And there was Adam's name mentioned repeatedly as the supervising engineer on the project. Claire read article after article, piecing together the narrative, and she saw how the media had painted Adam as negligent, how Castellon Development had released statements distancing themselves from his decisions, how there had been calls for criminal charges, though none were ultimately filed. And then she found follow-up articles from a year later that revealed the real story about the supplier, who had substituted substandard materials, about internal company emails, showing that Adam had raised concerns about those materials weeks before the collapse, about how Castellon had known about the issues, but pushed forward anyway to meet deadlines, and then had made Adam the scapegoat when everything went wrong. By the time Claire finished reading, it was past midnight, and she sat in her dark living room, still wearing Adam's jacket, and she felt a righteous anger building in her chest, anger at the injustice of what had happened to him, anger at a system that could destroy someone's entire life to protect corporate interests, anger at herself too, for all the time she had walked past homeless people without really seeing them, without considering that each one had a story and history and had once been someone with a career and dreams and people who loved them. Claire made a decision then, sitting in the dark wearing a homeless man's jacket with her successful, perfect life, feeling hollow and meaningless. She decided that she was going to find Adam Thompson again, and she was going to help him somehow, not out of pity, but because his act of kindness had reminded her what actually mattered in life, and because she had resources and connections, and maybe for once she could use her success for something meaningful beyond quarterly profits and investor presentations. The next morning, a Saturday, Claire woke early after another night of fragmented sleep, punctuated by dreams of bus stops and collapsing buildings, and she put on jeans and a simple shirt instead of her usual designer athleisure wear, and she wrapped Adam's jacket around her shoulders, even though it was supposed to be warm today, and she drove her Tesla back to the same bus stop in Biscaville, where they had met the night before, hoping that maybe Adam would be there again. But the bench was empty, occupied only by a young mother with two small children who were arguing over a bag of chips. Claire sat in her car for 2 hours watching the bus stop and feeling increasingly foolish, because what were the odds that Adam would return to this exact location? And even if he did, would he want to be found by her? Or would he feel embarrassed that she had discovered his situation? But she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something, that last night's encounter meant something important, and she refused to let it just become another forgotten moment in her busy life. When Adam didn't appear, Claire decided to try a different approach, and she drove to the public library that served this area, because she remembered noticing Adam's resumes had looked freshly printed, and libraries were where people without homes often went to use computers and printers and bathrooms, and simply to sit in, a quiet place where no one would bother them for a few hours. And when she walked into the library, she felt out of place in her expensive car keys and Apple Watch among the patrons who were clearly using this space as more than just a place to borrow books. Claire approached the front desk, where an older Asian woman with kind eyes and reading glasses on a chain was helping someone process a library card. And when the woman finished and looked up at Claire with a professional smile, Claire found herself suddenly nervous about how to phrase her question without sounding strange. "Hi," Claire began. "I'm looking for someone named Adam Thompson. He might come here to use the computers or print resumes. Do you know him?" And Claire knew this. Was a long shot, knew that librarians probably saw hundreds of people every day and had no reason to remember one particular patron. But something in the woman's expression changed when Claire said Adam's name. "Adam," she repeated. "Yes, I know Adam. He comes in several times a week to job search and print applications." She paused, studying Claire more carefully. "Why are you looking for him?" And there was a protective note in her voice that made Claire like her immediately, because it meant someone was watching out for Adam, even in small ways. Claire explained about the encounter at the bus stop, about the jacket, which she held up as evidence, and about how she had researched his background and learned what happened with Castellon, and wanted to help him if she could, and she wasn't sure how much to reveal about her own position, because she had learned that sometimes when people knew she was a CEO, they treated her differently, became either obsequious or resentful. But something about this librarian made her want to be honest. The librarian whose name tag read. Mrs. Chen listened carefully, and her expression softened, and when Claire finished, Mrs. Chen nodded slowly and said, "Adam is a good man. He doesn't deserve what happened to him. He always thanks me for helping him print his resumes, and he helps other patrons with computer problems, even though he has his own troubles, and he never complains, just keeps trying to find work, even though I can see how hard it is for him." "You know where he stays?" Claire asked. "Where I might find him," and Mrs. Chen hesitated, clearly weighing whether to share this information, whether Claire was trustworthy, whether Adam would want to be found. But finally she said, "He usually stays at the Hope Harbor shelter on 28th Street, but I know they've been full lately, so sometimes he sleeps in Riverside Park," and she gave Claire directions and added, "Be gentle with him, okay? His pride has taken enough hits." Claire thanked her, and as she turned to leave, Mrs. Chen called after her and said, "Whatever you're thinking of doing, make sure it's something real, something with dignity. Adam doesn't need charity, he needs a chance." And Claire nodded, understanding what Mrs. Chen meant, because she had been thinking the same thing, that Adam didn't need a handout. He needed an opportunity to rebuild his life on his own terms. Claire drove to the Hope Harbor shelter, which was a low concrete building that looked more like a warehouse than a place where human beings sought refuge, and she parked across the street and watched people coming and going. Some clearly residents and others volunteers bringing donations, and she waited for over an hour before she saw him. Adam walking down the sidewalk, with his distinctive backpack and his manila folder, and without his jacket, obviously, because she still had it. And he looked tired in the harsh daylight, more worn than he had seemed at the bus stop. And Claire felt a pang of guilt for having his jacket when he so clearly needed it. She got out of her car and crossed the street, calling his name Adam, and he turned, looking confused and then surprised when he recognized her. and Claire saw a flash of embarrassment cross his face as he glanced at the shelter behind him and back at her, and understood that she now knew exactly where he was staying and what his situation was. "Clare Langston," he said, and his voice carried that same rough warmth she remembered from the night before. "What are you doing here?" And he didn't ask it rudely, but with genuine bewilderment, as if he couldn't imagine why someone like her would seek him out in his world. "I came to return your jacket," Claire said, holding it out. "But that's not the only reason I wanted to talk to you about something," and she could see him tensing, preparing for whatever was coming next, and she realized she needed to be careful here, needed to follow Mrs. Chen's advice about dignity and respect. "I know what happened to you," she continued, with Castellan Development. "I read about the building collapse and the investigation, and I know you weren't responsible." Adam's face closed off immediately, and he took a step back, and Claire could see she had said the wrong thing or said it the wrong way, because now he looked defensive and wounded, and he said, "I don't need your pity if that's why you're here," and his voice had gone hard, losing that warmth. "It's not pity," Claire said quickly. "I'm here because you showed me extraordinary kindness last night when you had every reason not to, and because I think what happened to you was unjust, and because I run a company, and I might be able to help. Not with charity, but with a job if you're interested," and she said it all in a rush, worried he would walk away before she could finish. Adam stared at her, and Claire could see him processing this offer, looking for the catch. Because there had to be a catch. Nothing came free in life, especially not for someone who had lost everything, and he said, "What kind of job doing?" "What?" And his voice was cautious, but Claire heard a note of desperate hope underneath the caution that broke her heart. A little. Claire explained that she ran a tech startup called Langston Solutions that developed project management software for construction and engineering firms, and that they were expanding and needed someone with real-world engineering experience to help them understand the challenges their clients faced and to potentially develop new features that would actually be useful rather than just technically impressive, and she emphasized that she wasn't offering him a pity position, but a real role that would utilize his expertise and experience. Adam listened without interrupting, and when Claire finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You have no reason to trust me. My reputation in this industry is destroyed. No one will work with me." And there was such defeat in his voice, such accumulated rejection, that Claire understood why his 5 interviews yesterday had all failed, because this defeat showed through no matter how professional he tried to appear. "Because I do know you," Claire said firmly. "At least I know the most important thing, which is that you're a person with integrity and kindness even when life has given you every reason to be bitter and angry. And because my company needs someone who understands not just engineering but also what it means to fail and rebuild and care about doing things right even when it's hard." And she meant every word, even though part of her brain was screaming that this was reckless, that she was making a major business decision based on a 5-minute interaction at a bus stop. But her instinct told her this was right, told her that Adam Thompson was exactly the kind of person she wanted working with her. "What about my background?" Adam asked. "The lawsuit and everything people will find out, and they'll question your judgment for hiring me." And Claire appreciated that he was thinking about how this might affect her, because it showed he understood business implications even in his desperate situation. Let them question it. Claire said, "I'll deal with that, and honestly, Adam, the more I read about what happened, the angrier I got that you were made a scapegoat for corporate negligence. You tried to do the right thing and got punished for it. Well, I'm offering you a chance to work for someone who values doing the right thing over protecting the bottom line." And she realized as she said it, that this was true, that somewhere along the way, in building her company, she had lost sight of her original values, and maybe helping Adam was also about helping herself remember why she started this business in the first place. They talked for another hour, standing on the sidewalk outside the homeless shelter, and Claire learned about Adam's daughter Emma, who he hadn't spoken to in over a year because he was too ashamed to tell her what had happened, and about his slow descent into homelessness after his savings ran out and he couldn't find work, and about the small kindnesses people had shown him along the way, like Mrs. Chen at the library and the shelter director who always tried to save him a bed. and about his determination to keep submitting resumes and going to interviews, even though each rejection made it harder to believe he would ever recover from this. And Adam learned about Claire's company, about her vision for creating software that actually helped people do their jobs better, rather than just looking impressive, in sales presentations, and about her own struggles with loneliness and purpose, despite her success, and about how his simple act of giving her his jacket had affected her more deeply than he could know, because it reminded her that human connection and kindness mattered more than any business achievement. When Claire finally offered to drive Adam to get lunch, he hesitated, and then accepted, and they went to a small Cuban restaurant, where Claire ordered far more food than two people could eat, and she pretended not to notice how hungry Adam was, or how he carefully wrapped half his meal to save for later, and they continued talking about engineering and software and what Adam's role at her company might look like, and Claire felt more energized and purposeful than she had in months, because this felt real and meaningful, in a way her usual business dealings didn't. By the end of lunch, they had the outline of a plan. Adam would start as a consultant to avoid any immediate employment complications, and Claire would set him up with temporary housing through a program she knew about that helped people transition out of homelessness, and he would begin working with her development team immediately to provide insight on the user experience from an actual engineer's perspective, and they would take it from there, seeing how things developed without putting pressure on either of them for this to be permanent if it didn't work out. Adam agreed to all of this, but Claire could see he didn't quite believe it was real, yet didn't trust that this wasn't somehow going to fall apart or be taken away. And she understood that feeling because she had experienced her own versions of it. The sense that good things were always temporary, while suffering was permanent, and she made a mental note to be patient with him, to understand that rebuilding trust and confidence would take time. Over the next few weeks, Adam Thompson's life transformed in ways he had stopped believing were possible, and Claire kept her promises, arranging for him to move into a small furnished apartment through a transitional housing program, and setting him up with an office at Langston Solutions, where he immediately began working with the development team, and Adam approached every task with the thoroughness and attention to detail that had made him a successful engineer in his previous life. And his insights were invaluable, helping the team redesign features that looked good in theory, but would have been frustrating in actual practice. Adam's colleagues at Langston Solutions learned his background gradually, and while a few were skeptical at first, his competence and humility won them over. And Claire made it clear through her actions that she trusted Adam completely, and that anyone who had a problem with his presence could take it up with her directly, and no one did, because it quickly became apparent that Adam was making the company's products significantly better. Claire and Adam developed an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect and understanding, and they had lunch together most days, talking about work and life and their shared experience of feeling disconnected from the worlds they inhabited. And Claire found herself confiding in Adam about her struggles in ways she rarely did with anyone else, because he listened without judgment and offered perspective that came from having lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. Adam slowly began reconnecting with his daughter, Emma, starting with a difficult phone call where he explained everything that had happened and apologized for disappearing from her life, and Emma, who was angrier than Adam expected, but also relieved to hear from him, gradually forgave him. And they began rebuilding their relationship through regular video calls and texts, and Adam showed her pictures of his apartment and office, and introduced her virtually to Claire, who Emma immediately liked and approved of. 6 months after that encounter, at the bus stop, Adam Thompson was no longer homeless, no longer hopeless, no longer defined by his lowest moment. And while he still carried the scars of what he had been through, both visible and invisible, he had rediscovered his sense of purpose and worth, and he often thought about how different his life would be if Clare Langston hadn't been sitting at that bus stop, if he had decided to keep his jacket, if she hadn't decided to find him again and help him rebuild. And Claire often thought about that night too, about how close she had come to just taking a different bus or calling an Uber instead of waiting at that stop, about how one small act of kindness from a stranger had given her back a sense of meaning she had lost somewhere along the path to success, and about how helping Adam had helped her remember what actually mattered in life, beyond quarterly earnings and company valuations. The jacket that started everything hung in Claire's closet, still unwashed, because she wanted to preserve it exactly as Adam had given it to her. And sometimes, when she had particularly difficult days when the pressure of running a company felt overwhelming, she would take it out and hold it, and remember that there were things more important than success, things like kindness and dignity and human connection, and that sometimes the people who seem to have the least have the most to teach us about what really matters in life.